This is a copper cathode. 3 feet square, half an inch thick, weighing about 200 pounds. Pure copper, 99.99%. Refined from ore that was blasted from Chilean mountains, crushed, floated, smelted, and electrolytically purified into this gleaming red-brown sheet. Every smartphone contains about 15 grams of copper. Every electric vehicle contains 180 pounds. Every home contains 400 pounds of copper wiring. Every data center, every power plant, every wind turbine, every piece of infrastructure that makes modern life possible depends on copper flowing from mines to manufacturers. Chile produces 27% of global copper supply, more than any other nation, more than the next two producers combined. The Chilean copper industry isn't just dominant, it's irreplaceable at any timeline that matters. 3 days ago, Chile decided to stop sharing. On January 21, 2026, at 6 a.m. Santiago time, President Gabriel Boric announced the Sovereign Mineral Future Initiative, legislation that restricts copper exports to 60% of current levels, effective immediately, with further reductions to 40% over 24 months. Not price increases, not quotas with flexibility, hard caps on export volumes enforced by state control of every port, every rail line, every truck that might carry copper toward international markets. The world consumes 26 million metric tons of copper annually. Chilean exports of 5.6 million metric tons represent 22% of globally traded copper. Reducing those exports by 40% removes 2.2 million metric tons from global supply. That's enough copper for 27 million electric vehicles that won't be built. Enough for 400 million smartphones that won't be manufactured. Enough for electrical infrastructure that won't be constructed. 120 days of existing inventory and pipeline supply. Then, electronics manufacturing begins shutting down. Here's what they're not telling you. Chile's copper dominance has been a geopolitical constant for decades. The Escondida mine, the Collahuasi mine, the El Teniente mine, each among the largest copper operations on Earth, each feeding global supply chains that assume Chilean copper will continue flowing. The assumption was reasonable. Chile has been a reliable supplier since the Pinochet-era privatizations of the 1980s. Foreign mining companies, BHP, Rio Tinto, Glencore, Freeport, invested billions in Chilean operations based on stable regulatory environments and open export policies. The stability masked growing discontent. Chilean copper wealth has enriched foreign shareholders, while Chilean communities bear environmental costs. The Atacama Desert, where most mining occurs, has been transformed into industrial landscape. Water resources that communities need for survival have been diverted to mining operations. Air quality in mining regions ranks among the worst in the Americas. President Boric was elected in 2022 on promises to rebalance the relationship between mining wealth and Chilean society. His first term delivered modest reforms, increased royalties, environmental requirements, indigenous consultation processes. The reforms were insufficient to satisfy his base, while alienating mining companies who warned of investment flight. The Sovereign Mineral Future Initiative is Boric's second-term gambit, a comprehensive restructuring that transforms Chile from copper exporter to copper processor, from raw material supplier to manufacturing hub. At 8:30 a.m. Santiago time on January 21st, I obtained the initiative's implementation documents through a source in Chile's Ministry of Mining. The documents reveal ambitions that exceed the export restriction headlines. Export restriction. Immediate cap at 3.36 million metric tons annually, 60% of current 5.6 million metric tons. Reduction to 2.24 million metric tons by January 2028. Processing requirement. All copper not exported must be processed domestically into value-added products, wire, cable, electronics components, finished goods. The requirement creates captive supply for Chilean manufacturing. Domestic manufacturing investment. $47 billion government commitment over 10 years to build copper processing and electronics manufacturing facilities. Chile aims to produce finished products rather than raw materials. Foreign investment restructuring. Existing mining concessions honored but not renewed upon expiration. New mining requires 51% Chilean state or domestic private ownership. Foreign majority ownership phases out over 15 years. Employment transition. Mining employment, approximately 200,000 workers, maintained while manufacturing employment, target 500,000 workers, develops. The transition timeline spans the entire 15-year restructuring period. Each element serves the overarching goal: transform Chile from commodity exporter to industrial economy. The transformation is economically rational for Chile. Processing adds value that currently accrues to foreign manufacturers. The transformation is catastrophic for everyone depending on Chilean copper exports. At 10 a.m. Eastern on January 21st, copper futures experienced a limit-up halt. Trading resumed after 15 minutes. Prices jumped another 8% before halting again. By market close, copper had risen 34%, the largest single-day move since the Hunt brothers' silver squeeze of 1980. The price response reflects immediate supply-demand recalculation. Global copper demand, 26 million metric tons. Pre-initiative supply, approximately 26 million metric tons. Post-initiative supply, approximately 23.8 million metric tons. A 2.2 million metric ton deficit cannot clear at any reasonable price. Either demand is destroyed or new supply emerges. New supply takes 5 to 10 years to develop. Demand destruction happens through manufacturing shutdown. At 12 p.m. Eastern on January 21st, I spoke with a procurement executive at a major electronics manufacturer. The executive, who requested anonymity, described the company's immediate response. We're calling every copper supplier globally, trying to secure alternative supply. There is no alternative supply at the volumes we need. We source 40% of our copper from Chile. Replacing 40% of supply within 120 days is physically impossible. I asked about inventory levels. Industry-wide, refined copper inventory totals approximately 850,000 metric tons, about 12 days of global consumption. Pipeline supply, copper in transit, in processing, awaiting delivery, adds maybe another 90 days. After that, manufacturing stops. I asked about demand reduction options. What do we cut? Smartphones, electric vehicles, power grid infrastructure? Everything requires copper. We can't substitute at scale. Aluminum works for some applications, but not electronics. We're facing a situation where physical shortage forces production cuts regardless of price. The executive's assessment aligns with industry-wide panic. Electronics manufacturing runs on just-in-time inventory systems designed for cost efficiency, not supply resilience. The systems have no buffer for 8.5% supply reduction. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. Global commodity markets assume supply responds to price signals. Higher prices incentivize production, attract investment, bring marginal resources into development. The assumption underpins market confidence that shortages are self-correcting. Chile's initiative breaks the assumption. Supply restriction isn't responding to market failure. It's a policy choice immune to price signals. Chile doesn't need higher prices to produce more copper. Chile is choosing to produce less copper regardless of price. The choice reflects different optimization. Markets optimize for efficiency, maximum output at minimum cost. Chile optimizes for national development, maximum domestic value capture, regardless of global efficiency loss. The optimization conflict cannot be resolved through market mechanisms. Chile won't export more copper at any price. The supply Chile withholds is supply the market cannot replace through price-induced production increases. At 2 p.m. Santiago time on January 21st, President Boric addressed the nation explaining the initiative's logic. For 150 years, Chile has exported copper and imported poverty. Our mountains have enriched foreign shareholders while our communities have suffered. Our children breathe contaminated air while executives in London and New York count profits from our labor. This injustice ends today. The Sovereign Mineral Future Initiative keeps Chilean copper in Chile. We will build the factories that transform our copper into products. We will create the jobs that give our children futures. We will capture the value that has been stolen from us for generations. The world may complain, let them complain. Chilean copper belongs to Chileans. We decide what to do with our resources. We decide what future to build. And we decide that our future will no longer subsidize everyone else's prosperity while we remain poor. The speech resonated domestically. Chilean polling shows 73% support for export restrictions, a remarkable consensus in a politically divided nation. The support reflects accumulated grievance that Boric's initiative channels into policy. The support constrains policy reversal. Future Chilean governments cannot easily abandon the initiative without alienating the coalition that makes governance possible. The restriction becomes embedded in Chilean political economy, regardless of international pressure. Less than 120 days separate today from the point where copper shortage begins forcing manufacturing shutdown. The timeline is determined by inventory depletion rates and the physical impossibility of alternative supply development. Days 0 through 30, panic buying depletes visible inventories. Copper prices rise 60 to 80% as buyers secure supply regardless of cost. Strategic reserves, held by governments, manufacturers, and speculators, are drawn down. Days 30 to 60. Pipeline supply continues but slows as Chilean exports reduce. Secondary copper, recycled, prices spike, driving increased recycling collection but insufficient to close the gap. Manufacturing continues using contracted supply. Days 60 to 90. Spot copper becomes unavailable at any price. Manufacturers dependent on spot supply begin production cuts. Electronics component shortages emerge. Consumer electronics prices rise 30 to 50%. Days 90 to 120. Contracted supply begins depleting. Large manufacturers face allocation decisions: which products to produce, which to discontinue. Automotive EV production slows as motor components become unavailable. Grid infrastructure projects halt. Beyond 120 days, sustained shortage. Manufacturing reshoring to copper-producing nations. Global electronics production permanently reduced until alternative supply develops. 5 to 10-year timeline. The timeline assumes no policy reversal and no emergency response that creates supply Chile's initiative removes. Both assumptions may prove incorrect, but alternatives require developments that cannot be predicted with confidence. When essential materials become scarce, geopolitical responses escalate beyond commercial negotiation. U.S. response. At 4 p.m. Washington time on January 21st, the State Department summoned Chile's ambassador for urgent consultations. The consultation reportedly included discussion of potential sanctions, trade restrictions, and review of bilateral agreements. The threats are largely empty. Chile is not dependent on U.S. market access. China is Chile's largest trading partner. Sanctions would harm American consumers more than Chilean producers. The leverage asymmetry favors Chile. At 6 p.m. Washington time, the Pentagon confirmed assessment of strategic mineral implications for defense production. Copper is essential for military electronics, munitions, and vehicles. The assessment reportedly concluded that U.S. strategic copper reserves total approximately 6 months of defense industrial base needs, adequate for short-term emergency, but insufficient for sustained shortage. Chinese response. At 9 p.m. Beijing time on January 21st, Chinese commerce officials arrived in Santiago for emergency trade discussions. China's approach differs from American threats. China offers partnership rather than punishment. I obtained preliminary details of Chinese proposals through a source familiar with the discussions. China offered guaranteed purchase of all Chilean copper at 15% above market price, $34 billion investment in Chilean processing facilities, supplementing rather than competing with Chilean government investment, technology transfer for electronics manufacturing, preferential market access for Chilean manufactured goods. The Chinese offer aligns with Chilean objectives while securing Chinese supply. If Chile accepts, the export restrictions apply to everyone except China. The initiative becomes instrument of Chinese supply security rather than Chilean autonomy. At 11 p.m. Santiago time on January 21st, President Boric's spokesperson stated that Chile would consider all partnership proposals consistent with national sovereignty objectives. The statement left the door open to Chinese partnership while not committing to any single relationship. European response. At 7 a.m. Brussels time on January 22nd, the European Commission convened an emergency session on critical material supply disruption. European manufacturing, automotive, electronics, renewable energy equipment, depends on copper imports that the Chilean initiative disrupts. The Commission announced immediate review of strategic copper reserve requirements and accelerated permitting for European copper mining projects. The announcements acknowledge vulnerability without providing near-term solutions. European copper mines that could theoretically expand take 5 to 7 years to develop. The Commission cannot accelerate geology. What the informed understand is that Chile's initiative represents the maturation of resource nationalism into resource strategy. Previous resource nationalism, OPEC oil embargoes, Chinese rare earth restrictions, Indonesian nickel bans, used supply restriction as leverage for commercial advantage. The restrictions aimed at higher prices or better terms within existing trade relationships. Chile's initiative aims differently. The goal isn't better terms for copper exports. The goal is ending copper exports entirely, replacing raw material sales with manufactured goods sales. The initiative transforms Chile's position in global value chains rather than optimizing within current position. The transformation, if successful, provides a template that other resource-rich nations will study. Congo with cobalt, Australia with lithium, South Africa with platinum group metals. Each nation could theoretically transition from commodity exporter to manufacturer using Chile's model. The proliferation of Chile's model would fundamentally reshape global manufacturing geography. Production would relocate from established manufacturing centers to resource locations. The efficiency losses from dispersed manufacturing would raise costs throughout the global economy. At 1 a.m. Santiago time on January 22nd, I spoke with a Chilean economist who advised on the initiative's development. The economist requested anonymity to speak freely. The initiative accepts short-term costs for long-term transformation. Export revenue falls immediately. Manufacturing revenue grows gradually. The gap creates fiscal stress that we've modeled and prepared for. The international pressure will be intense. We expect it. We're prepared to sustain the initiative through pressure because the alternative, continued raw material dependency, leads to the same poverty we've experienced for a century. Other nations have industrialized through similar strategies. South Korea restricted raw material exports while building manufacturing in the 1970s. China restricted rare earth exports while building processing capability. We're following proven models with our own resources. I asked about the humanitarian implications of electronics shortage. We regret the disruption, but Chilean children breathing contaminated air while foreign companies profit from our copper is also a humanitarian issue that has been ignored for decades. We're asking the world to recognize that resource-producing nations have interests too. The copper cathode weighs 200 pounds. The copper inside it will become wire in an automobile, traces on a circuit board, coils in a motor, connections in a power grid. The transformations create value that Chile currently exports along with the copper. The initiative keeps the copper. The transformations happen in Chile. The value accrues to Chileans. The logic is economically coherent. Chile is correct that processing adds value. Chile is correct that raw material export perpetuates dependency. Chile is correct that foreign mining profits have flowed out of Chile for generations. Chile is also correct that the initiative will cause global manufacturing disruption. The disruption is not accidental, it's the leverage that makes the initiative sustainable. If the world could easily replace Chilean copper, Chile couldn't demand transformation. The irreplaceability is the power. 27% of global supply, 40% reduction, 120 days until shortage. The numbers describe leverage that Chile has never before exercised. The exercise is disruptive, painful, and potentially devastating for global manufacturing. The exercise is also rational from Chilean perspective. The pain falls on consumers and manufacturers who have benefited from cheap copper for generations. The benefit accrues to Chileans who have paid the environmental and social costs of extraction. Whether that rebalancing is just depends on whose interests you're measuring. The copper cathode doesn't care about justice. It's just metal, useful, valuable, essential. But the 19 million Chileans who live above the copper, who breathe the air contaminated by its extraction, who watch the wealth flow to foreign accounts, they care about justice. And they just elected a president willing to claim it. 120 days. The countdown to electronics shortage started 3 days ago. The copper stays in Chile now. The world will adapt, or the world will do without. Chile decided. The copper belongs to them. What they do with it is their choice. They've chosen to keep it. The world is about to discover what that choice costs everyone else. $47 billion in Chilean manufacturing investment, zero flexibility in export restriction, 120 days of supply remaining. The numbers describe a future being rewritten in real time. The cathode weighs 200 pounds. The weight of what it represents is being measured in supply chains worldwide, and the measurement is just beginning.